Let's consider a variation on an adjustable rate mortgage, and that would be an interest-only arm. So let's assume a $100,000 interest-only arm with a 30-year maturity and an initial rate of 6%. Let's calculate the payment for the first year. Well, if it's interest only, then the payment is just going to be the $100,000 principal times the periodic interest rate, which is 0.06 divided by 12. So that's going to give us a monthly payment of $500. Now, if at the reset date the index has increased and the new interest rate becomes 8%, what is the new monthly payment? Well, we're just going to do the same thing because it's an interest-only loan. So now it's just going to be 100,000 times 0.08 divided by 12, or a monthly payment of $666.67. Now, what if the borrower instead wishes to make payments which will fully amortize the loan balance over the remaining term? What would be the new payment? Well, 1 year has passed, so there's 29 years left on this mortgage. So N is going to be 29 times 12, which is 348. The interest rate will be that new rate of 8%, so 8 divided by 12, or 0.6667. The present value will be $100,000 because they'd only made interest payments up to this point, so the principal stays the same, and the future value will be 0 because we're wishing now to fully amortize the loan. If we solve for payment, we will get a payment of $739.95. So let's think then about how interest rates and interest rate behavior is associated with risk. As more interest rate risk is assumed by the lender is going to demand a higher risk premium. When interest rate risk is assumed by the borrower, though, the default risk assumed by the lender increases, meaning the more risk in terms of the interest rate, which therefore would mean higher payments to the borrower, the greater the chances of default. So it's a little bit of a tricky proposition for the lender because they've got to set the interest rate high enough that they're compensated for interest rate risk, but low enough that they do not push that borrower into a high default probability category. So at origination, the expected yield on an adjustable rate mortgage should be less than the expected yield on a fixed rate mortgage, because remember, over time, that adjustable rate will likely increase, and so we don't want it to increase so much that we run into default risk issues. Adjustable rate mortgages tied to short-term indexes are generally riskier to the borrower than those that are tied to long-term indexes because there's more volatility in those short-term indexes. So the likelihood that the rate will increase and therefore the payment will increase is going to be higher. Adjustable rate mortgages with shorter time intervals between adjustments in payments are generally riskier to borrowers than those with longer time periods because you have to assume, in order to be conservative, that on the reset date, the payment's always going to go up. So for the borrower's perspective, they want longer periods between the reset dates so that they have some certainty and some ability to plan their cash flows, or at least a longer period of certainty and ability to plan cash flows. So to the extent that adjustable rate mortgages contain maximum caps on interest rate adjustments, the interest rate risk incurred by borrowers will be lower. Because if I can negotiate a deal where my interest rate can only go up by a certain amount, then that gives me some ability to plan as well. So I would just plan that it's going to increase by that cap amount. And if it doesn't go up that much, then that's a bonus, but at least I know what the worst case scenario is. And so allows me a little bit more certainty, and the more certainty, the less risk. Now, if an adjustable rate mortgage has negative amortization due to a payment cap, the effect of changes in interest rates will not materially reduce interest rate risk to borrowers. So if I've got a payment cap, that means that my payment can only go up by so much. But if interest rates rise, it's possible that that payment cap means that I'm not paying enough to cover the interest. And so I don't have enough going to principal, or maybe nothing at all. And so that's what's creating negative amortization potentially. Now, the initial loan terms will reflect the net effect of the amount of interest rate risk assumed by the lender as determined by the index chosen, the adjustment period, and any caps or negative amortization, and the amount of default risk assumed by the lender as determined by the amount of interest rate risk shifted to a specific borrower. So all we're saying is that, again, there's this trade-off between interest rate risk and default risk. If I'm the lender, ideally I want to put all of the risk on the borrower, and that makes life easier for me. But because the more interest rate risk I push off to the borrower, the more likely they are to default. So that's not going to necessarily be the best choice.